Yeah, Mortal Kombat! But first,
let's start with a brief but necessary philosophical digression.
Violence is inherent to man. There has always been a great infatuation, if not obsession, with violence in human beings since time immemorial. Examples of that quintessential component in man are legion in history. It has to be emphasized, kids in first world countries from Generation X, or even less so millennials, had never been in real proximity of a war context. They were the first entirely sheltered youth generation growing up in the war-free city life, dominated by electronic goods and media that has been so common for decades. Lots of the attention that went into real-life events and preoccupations was now turned to the consumerist fantasy world of TV sports, movies, series, anime and cartoons, and video games. To compensate for the lack of actual violent acts occurring in the everyday life, boys would find ways to recreate the conditions of that thrill for violence through storytelling, scary or gory tales, playing rough outdoor games and contact sports, and of course, watching action and horror films, or better yet for them, any recorded actual footage or documentary exhibiting real-life violent disturbing acts. The life setup had changed, but the yearning for blood remained in the human DNA. Now, there were violent games before Mortal Kombat, but they were all fringe and fairly obscure games, far from the mainstream, and Wolfenstein 3D did come out months earlier that year in 1992, and although it too made its fame through violence and controversy, it wasn't nearly the intense experience Mortal Kombat was. Essentially, Mortal Kombat blended the three perfect elements to attract the young, action-crazed consumer of 1992. First and most obvious, utilizing the platform of the 1 vs 1 fighting video game. Watching action movies was fun, but actually playing the game commanding the fighter in real time and kicking ass was exhilarating. But plenty of games had been doing that for some time. The second element was the realistic digitized actor sprites, which along with the third element, graphic violence and dark imagery, immersed the juvenile consumer in an experience he wouldn't have dreamed of. The darker aspect of the game was essential in distinguishing itself from the other family-friendly, cartoonish, sanitized fighter games. It was adult content, or so it was promoted that way. It was like no other game around. Some games had one or two of those elements, but none blended all three this well. Direct one-on-one fighting, realistic sprites, graphic violence, dark imagery. When the original came out in 1992, it promoted itself as the world's most advanced interactive fighting experience, which language definitely implies more than just mere casual video game fun. Mortal Kombat meant to be a true, immersive fighting experience for the player. And given the natural impulse for violence in human beings, covered earlier, it's no wonder all the kids were drawn to MK. It was, in essence, the most realistic means to partake in combat, feel the testosterone levels rising, and measure up to the other kids, without getting any actual bruises. Mortal Kombat was also very clever in establishing powerful patented moves and iconic moments in the game. The uppercut, screen shaking, player helplessly flying in the air, and of course, the fatality. Whether variants of it existed before is irrelevant. Mortal Kombat were the ones to make it huge. Characters had famous lines that were memorable and immediate classics.
Get over!
The creators were smart in immortalizing the uppercut further by making it the move that would propel the opponent to his death and stage fatalities, which gave the game more of a 3D element in how the player could interact with the surrounding stage. There was a feeling of sheer power in the game that couldn't be replicated elsewhere, and that emphatic power and bloody gore allowed all these kids to at least in part release their frustrations and teen angst, and sometimes their own violence in a monitored, safe way. Not all kids are born athletic or predisposed for rough-and-tumble confrontation, and a game like Mortal Kombat allowed for head-to-head competition with oomph and the ability to own opponents. In fact, this is why the game introduced so many finishing moves like the Babality or later the Brutality, to further expand on the humiliation factor the game supplied its best players. This was the real deal. As the franchise released the sequels Mortal Kombat 2 and the Mortal Kombat 3 series, The gameplay became more and more addictive with the ability to land complex hard-hitting combos with brutal aggression and dazzling kinetic speed, emphasizing that power factor and allowing the player to exert a commanding control. If properly wielded, a fighter could feel utterly mighty and unstoppable. MK also did remarkably well at creating a universe of its own, with a very distinct mythological world comprising ninjas taking on deities and fantasy creatures, hybrid sub-bosses, cyborgs, and other imaginative characters all partaking in Mortal Kombat. The creative diversity of blending pure sci-fi with Shaolin Far East martial arts, with orcish armored beasts, and dark arts and sorcery. They created a unique flavor, as opposed to the other bland and redundant fighting games and their often plastic caricature characters. MK also emphasized story, and while they were not Nobel Prize worthy, they added real depth to those fascinating otherworldly entities. Characters died in some storylines. The tone of the game was epic and real. The game's plots, storylines, characters, and battle arenas all combined made the game seem so mysterious and intriguing compared to the other flatter, more predictable games. It felt like there was so much to discover and unravel about those strange characters, like there was so much potential there and that we couldn't get enough. A younger audience will always be drawn to mystery like flies to light. And how about those excellent settings? Rich textured, detailed levels that all had some sort of backstory and mystique about them, along with the often superb stage soundtracks. The stages and music set the tone for the most atmospheric experience playing the game, ranging from dark and beautiful to eerie and sinister, to fast and energetic, to flat-out powerful and awe-inspiring. Another important aspect that kept players coming was the difficulty of the games. It took quite a bit of time to develop the right strategies against each character. They introduced those long Destiny towers, the daunting endurance rounds. There was an intimidating factor at play and an epic aspect in beating the monstrous gargantuan sub-bosses and Shao Kahn, who were overpowered. There was this generally ominous feel to the game. One of the benchmarks in Mortal Kombat games was the tongue-in-cheek comic relief, as well as the Easter eggs, which also added to the infatuation for the game. Secret, exceptionally powerful characters could be challenged after particular button combinations at particular times. They were rare and hard as hell to beat, which only made the game more irresistible. Famously, kids at the time, well before the internet and online forums, thought they could fight or play as rumored hidden characters. In conclusion, Mortal Kombat was popular because of its realistic visuals and immersive action-packed experience, along with the obvious violence factor that seduced all the teenagers, but that wasn't all. It also avoided being a cheap cardboard-thin fighter game and introduced lots of depth in the atmosphere, with the music and sounds and with the stages, the epic tone of the saga, and an unforgettable mystique to the characters which all only made it more obsessing, more classic, and simply immortal.
Immortal.